Can we actually step back a little bit on definitions? Because you said that some of the ideas practically that you're playing with is democratic socialism. We talked about the higher level, the higher kind of vision of socialism, the ideals, the philosophical ideas. But how does it all fit into the big picture historically of ideas of Marxism, communism, and socialism as it was defined and experienced and implemented in the 20th century? So what's your key differences? Maybe even just like socialism, communism.
Yeah, well, I hate the no true Scotsman sort of response to this, which is, oh, that socialism is bad.
Yeah.
So it wasn't really socialism. And my socialism is good, so it is socialism. But I think that socialism and communism share a common ancestor, which is they both emerged out of the turmoil and development of late 19th century capitalism. And the fact that there was all these workers' parties that were organizing across the capitalist world. So in Europe, for instance, you had this mass party called the German Social Democratic Party, in the that became probably the most important, the most vibrant party in Germany in the 1880s and 1890s. But they were locked out of power because Germany at the time was still mostly autarchic. You know, it had a parliamentary democracy, but it was a very undemocratic democracy. And the Kaiser still ruled. And these movements took root across the capitalist world, but including in Russia and in conditions of illegality. So it was assumed for many, many years in the workers' movement across Europe and among socialists of Europe, they called themselves social democrats then, that the revolution would first probably happen in Germany, in this developed, growing hub of industrial capitalism, and not in semi-feudal Russia. But then World War I came. The workers' movement was split between parties that decided to either keep their head down or to implicitly support the war, and then support the war for now or keep your heads down. Don't get banned. Don't get arrested. Then we'll just take power after the war is over. And those like Russia, and also in the United States for that matter, that chose the path of resistance to the war. And it was the Bolshevik faction of the Russian movement, Lenin's Bolshevik Party, that took power in Russia after a period of turmoil where it didn't seem, well, was it going to go to the fascist right or was it going to go to the far left? There was a period of flux and turmoil in Russia, but definitely the old regime was not able to stand. And these Russian social democrats, these Bolsheviks, said social democracy has so betrayed the idea of internationalism and brotherhood and progress it was supposed to stand for that we can't call ourselves social democrats anymore. We're going to go back to this old term that Marx used. We're going to call ourselves communists. And that's where official kind of communism out of Russia emerged. In other parts of Europe, parties were actually able to take power, some in the interwar period, but most in the post-war period. And they also came out of this old social democratic movement. And these parties mostly just called themselves socialists. And a lot of them still on paper wanted to go beyond capitalism, but in practice, they just managed capitalism better in the interests of workers. But they all had the same common ancestor. And in practice, to me, social democracy means trying to insert doses of socialism within capitalism, but maintaining capitalism. Communism meant this attempt to build a socialism outside of capitalism in often authoritarian ways, in part because of the ideology of these communists, but in part because of the conditions in which they inherited. They weren't inheriting a democracy; they were inheriting a country that had been ruled by the czars for centuries, and with very little condition, like a very weak working class, very poor and devastated by war, and so on, where authoritarianism kind of lended itself to those conditions. Then there's me. Then there's democratic socialists, and the way I would define it is, we like a lot of what the social democrats accomplished, but we still believe in going beyond capitalism and not just building socialism within capitalism, but we believe in this ultimate vision of a world after capitalism.
What does that world look like, and how is it different from communism? Actually, maybe we can linger before we talk about your vision of democratic socialism. What was wrong with communism, Stalinism, implementation of communism in the Soviet Union? Why did it go wrong?
So,
And in what ways did it not go wrong? In what ways did it succeed?
let me start with the second part of that question. And that's a very difficult one to answer, in part because I morally and ethically am opposed to any form of authoritarianism or dictatorship. And often when you talk about the successes of a government or what it did developmentally that might have been positive, we have to abstract ourselves from what we morally believe and just kind of look at the record, right? I would say that the Soviet experiment started off in Lenin's time as the attempt to kind of just hold a holding action. Hey, we don't really have the conditions to rule this country. We have the support of the working class, or most of it, but the working class is only, 3% of the population. The peasantry is really against us. A lot of this 3% of the population has died in war, and half of them supported the Mensheviks and the more moderate socialists anyway. But the alternative in their minds was going to be a far right reaction, some sort of general taking power in a coup or whatever else, or just them ending up back in prison, because a lot of them were in prison under the Tsar, or just killed. So they figured, all right, we're going to have a holding action where we maintain as much of this territory of the old Russian Empire as possible. We'll try to slowly implement changes, restabilize the economy through something called a new economic program, which was kind of a form of social democracy, if you will, because it allowed market exchange for the peasants, combined with state ownership of industries in the cities. And for a while, it seemed to be working. The revolution never came that they were expecting in Western Europe, but in Russia itself, they were able to restabilize things by the middle or end of the 1920s, and they were able to build more of a popular base for some of their policies because people who had seen the chaos of World War One and revolution and then Civil War kind of just wanted stability. And after a decade plus of war, if you had a government that was able to give you enough to eat and a job, that was good enough for them. Then Stalin came into power and he wanted to rapidly industrialize. And his logic was the revolution's not going to come in the West. We need to build socialism in one country and we need to catch up with the West. We need to turn ourselves into an industrial powerhouse as quickly as possible. And that's where you got forced collectivization to try to increase the productivity of Russian agriculture through state ownership of previously fragmented agricultural holdings and through the implementation of mechanization, so bring in more machines to make agriculture more productive, all under state ownership, plus more ambitious attempts to build heavy industry through 5-year plans. Now, I say this kind of coolly, but we know in practice what that meant. Forced collectivization was a disaster. I mean, first of all, I think it was built on the faulty premise that scale always equals more productivity, when in fact, especially in agriculture, but in any field, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And it led to millions of deaths. It led to a famine. It led to a host of other problems. Industrialization, in the way that it happened under Stalin, also kind of unbalanced the Soviet economy to lean too heavy towards heavy industry, not enough for medium or light industry. But this did mean, especially the 5-year plan and industrialization, did manage to put Russia on a different developmental trajectory. So by the time the post-war period came, one, it might have gave them the ability to survive the Nazi invasion to begin with. That's a complicated question. And then by the time the post-war period came, Russia had kind of jumped ahead of its developmental trajectory in a way that a lot of other countries didn't do. There are a few examples, like Japan is one that managed to. If you kind of ran a scenario of where Japan would be in the 1870s, 1880s, and ran it 100 times, the Japan of the post-war period is kind of one of the best outcomes, right? And I think that you could say that about Russian economic development, its ability to catch up at a certain level to the West. And then after that, of course, later on, as economies got more complex, as they kind of moved beyond regular heavy industry, and as the main staple of the economy, the Russian economy and its command system was unable to adapt and cope, and ended up falling back behind the West again by the 1970s. So all this is a very long story to say that a lot went wrong in Russia. The economic picture is actually a little bit more complicated. Politically, I think it's just a small party without much popular support, but with real popular support in a couple cities, but without a lot of popular support, empire wide, took power, and they felt like they couldn't give back power, and they kept holding on to power, and eventually, among their ranks in these conditions, uh, one of history's great tyrants took power and was able to justify what he was doing, in the context of the Russian nation and development, but also all the threats that came from abroad. Through, the Civil War wasn't just a civil war; it was really an invasion by many imperial powers all around the world, as well. So I think a lot of it was conditions and circumstance. And I guess the question really is, to what role ideology played. Was there something within the socialist tradition that might have lent itself to authoritarianism? And that's something we should, talk about.
And that's a really complicated human question. It does seem that the rhetoric, the populism of workers unite, we've been fucked over for way too long. Let's stand together. Somehow that message allows flawed or evil people to take power. It seems like the rhetoric, the idea is so good. Maybe the utopian nature of the idea is so good that it allows a great speaker to take power. It's almost like if the mission, like, come with me, friends, beyond the horizon, a great land is waiting for us. That encourages sort of, dictators, authoritarians to take power. Is there something within that ideology that allows for that, for the sort of, for lying to people, essentially?
Well, I might surprise you with my answer, because I would say yes, maybe. But I think that it's not just socialism. Any sort of ideology that appeals to the collective and appeals to our long-term destiny, either as a species or as a nation or as a class or whatever else, can lend itself to authoritarianism. So you can see this in many of the nationalisms of the 20th century. Now, some of these nationalisms used incredibly lofty collective rhetoric, like in Sweden, the rhetoric of, we're going to create the people's home. We're going to make this a country with dignity for all Swedes. We're going to make this a country that's more developed, more free, and so on. And they managed to build a pretty excellent society, in my estimation, from that. In countries like fascist Germany and Italy, they managed to do horrendous things. In Japan, and horrendous things with that. In the U.S., with national popular appeals, FDR was able to unite a nation, to elevate ordinary working class people into a position where they felt like they had a real stake in the country, and I think did great things with the New Deal. In Russia, of course, this language was used to trample upon individual rights and to justify hardship and abuses of ordinary individual people in the name of a collective destiny. A destiny, of course, that was just decided by the party in power, and during the 30s and 40s by just Stalin himself, really. Now, I think that's really the case for making sure that we have a bedrock of civil rights and democracy. Then on top of that, we could debate. We could debate different national destinies. We could debate different appeals, different visions of the world. But as long as people have a say in what sacrifices they're being asked to do, and as long as those sacrifices don't take away what's fundamentally ours, which is our life, which is our basic rights.
And voice, our voice. So this complicated picture because help me understand. You mentioned that social democracy is trying to have social policies within a capitalist system, in part, but your vision, your hope for a social democracy is one that goes beyond that. How do you give everybody a voice while not becoming the Soviet Union, while not becoming where basically people are silenced either directly through violence or through the implied threat of violence and therefore fear?
So I think you need to limit the scope of where the state is and what the state can do and how the state functions, first of all. Now, for me, social democracy was like the equivalent of, I'll give a football analogy. It was the equivalent of, getting to the red zone and then kicking a field goal. You'll take the 3 points, but you would have rather got a touchdown. And for me, socialism would be the touchdown. It's not a separate, different playing field.
Some people would say socialism would be an interception.
Sure. No, and they would. I mean, they would have the right to again, to say that and to say we shouldn't go further.
And most coaches would take, would take the safe route, right? So you're going against the decision. Anyway, that analogy takes too far.
Yeah.
But I understand. So for you, the goal is full socialism.
But I'll take the 3 points. It's a part of. I just want to march down the field. I want to get within scoring position. The reason why we should really move from this analogy, but the reason why I call myself a socialist is looking through history and these examples of social democracy. You saw that they were able to give working class people lots of rights and income and power in their society. But at the end of the day, capitalists still had the ultimate power, which is the ability to withhold investment. So they could say in the late 1960s and the early 70s, listen, I was fine with this arrangement 10 years ago, but now I feel like I'm going to take my money and I'm going to go move to a different country, or I'm just going to not invest because my workers are paid too much. I'm still making money, but I feel like I could be making more. I need more of an upper hand, right? So their economic power is then challenging the democratic mandate of Swedish workers that were voting for the Social Democratic Party and were behind this advance. So to me, what socialism is in part is taking the means of production, right, where this capitalist power is coming from, and making it socially owned so that ordinary workers can control their workplaces, can make investment decisions, and so on. Now, does that mean total state ownership of everything or a planned economy? I don't think that makes any sense. I think that we should live in a society in which markets are harnessed and regulated and so on. My main problem is capitalist ownership, in part on normative grounds, just because I think that it doesn't make sense that we celebrate democracy in all these other spheres, but we have workplaces that are just treated like tyrannies. And in part because I think that ordinary workers would much prefer a system in which over time they, accrued shares and ownership, where they got, in addition to a base kind of wage, they got dividends from their firm being successful. And that they figured out how to, large firms, they're not going to be making day-to-day decisions by democratic vote, right? But maybe you would elect representatives, elected managements once every year or two, depending on your operating agreement and so on. That's kind of my vision of a socialist society. And this sounds, I hope, like agree or disagree, like it would not be a crazy leap into year zero, right? That this could be maybe a way in which we could take a lot of what's existing in society, but then just add this on top. But what it would mean is a society without a capitalist class. This class hasn't been, individually, these people, haven't been taken to re-education camps or whatever else, but they're just no longer in this position. And they're now part of the economy in other ways. Like they'll probably be the first set of highly competent technocrats and managers and so on. They'll probably be very well compensated for their time and expertise and whatever else. But to me, both the practical end of things, like taking away this ability to withhold investment and increasing our ability to democratically shape investment priorities and to continue down the road of social democracy. And on normative grounds, my kind of egalitarian belief that ordinary people should have more stake in their lives in the workplace leads me beyond social democracy to socialism.
So there's a tricky thing here. So in Ukraine especially, but in the Soviet Union, there's the kulaks. The possible trajectory of fighting for the beautiful message of respecting workers' rights has this dynamic of making an enemy of the capitalist class, too easily making an enemy of the capitalist class, with a central leader, populist leader, that says the rich and the powerful, they're taking advantage of you. We need to remove them. We need to put them in camps, perhaps. Not said explicitly until it happens. It can happen overnight. But just putting a giant pressure on that capitalist class. And again, the Stalin type figure takes hold. So I'm trying to understand how the mechanism can prevent that. And perhaps I'll sort of reveal my bias here, as I've been reading I was going to say too much, maybe not enough, but a lot about, books like Stalin's War in Ukraine. And just, I've been reading a lot about the 30s and the 40s for personal reasons related to my travels in Ukraine and all that kind of stuff. So I have a little bit of a focus on the historical implementations of communism currently without kind of an updated view of all the possible future implementations. So I just want to lay that out there. But I worry about the slippery slope into the authoritarian figure that takes this sexy message, destroys everyone who's powerful in the name of the working class, and then fucks the working class afterwards.
So, first of all, I think it's worth remembering that the socialist movement had different outcomes across Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And in some of these countries in Western Europe, there wasn't actually democracy before the workers' movement and before the socialist movement. So the battle in Sweden, for instance, was about establishing political democracy, establishing true representation for workers. And that's how the parties became popular. Same thing in Germany, too. Then it was the Social Democrats who were able to build political democracy. Then on top of that, add layers of economic democracy, social democracy. The Swedish Social Democrats ruled basically uninterrupted from the early 1930s until 1976. It's kind of crazy to think about, but they were just in government. They were the leading member of government. They had a few different coalition partners would shift. Sometimes they were with the agrarians. Sometimes they were with the communists briefly. But they ruled uninterrupted. And they lost an election in 1976, and they just left power. And then they got back into power in the 80s. So in other words, like, they created a democratic system, of course, with mass support of working class people. Then they truly honored the system, because when they lost power, they lost power. They left power. There's plenty of cases like that across Europe and the world, and in other countries like Korea and elsewhere, where the workers' movements, the most militant, the most class-centric workers, South Africa is the same way, created democratic systems. Now, Russia, I think a lot of what happened had to do with the fact that it was never a democratic country. It was ruled by a party, and the party itself was very easy to shift from a somewhat democratic party in Lenin's day to an authoritarian one in Russia. And there was no distinction then between the party and the state. So your authoritarian party then became authoritarian total control over the entirety of the state. Now, the fact that the Soviet system involved total state ownership of production meant that the authoritarianism of the party state could go even deeper into the lives of ordinary people compared to other horrific dictatorships like Pinochet's Chile and so on, when maybe you could find some solace like just at home or whatever else. You didn't have the same sort of totalitarian, like control of people's lives. But I would say that socialism itself has yielded different outcomes. Now, on the question of polarization, I guess that implies that this polarization, this distinction is a distinction that isn't real in society and that is kind of being manufactured or generated. So
You mean the capitalist class and the working class,
Yeah.
just to clarify? Yeah, okay.
So in certain populist distinctions, the division is basically arbitrary or made up. The us versus them polarization, depending who the us and who the them are. It's truly a something that's manufactured. But capitalism itself, as a system based on class division, whether you support it or oppose it, I think we should acknowledge it's based on class division. That is the thing creating that polarization. Now, I think what socialists try to do is we try to take bits of working class opposition to capitalism, to their lives, to the way they're treated at work, and so on. And yes, we do try to organize on those bases to help workers take collective action, to help them organize in political parties, and so on, to represent their interests, economic and otherwise. But the contradiction exists to begin with. And if anything, this system, which I'm proposing, democratic socialism, would be kind of a resolution of this conflict, this dilemma, this thing that has always existed since, chieftain and follower and so on. We've had class division since the Neolithic Revolution. I think this is a democratic road out of that tension and that division of humanity into people who own and people who have nothing to give but their ability to work.